Martin Scorsese's star-studded Western crime epic Killers of the Flower Moon is based on the grisly true story of the Osage murders. The movie stars longtime Scorsese collaborators Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro, as well as Lily Gladstone, Brendan Fraser, John Lithgow, and many more. At almost 3.5 hours long, it provides a thorough examination of the reign of terror that gripped Osage County, Oklahoma, and the U.S. as dozens of members of the Osage Indian Nation were brutally murdered in the early 1900s, necessitating the involvement of the FBI in its first major homicide investigation. The Osage murders represent one of the most gruesome true crime stories in American history, as well as one of the most debased conspiracy cover-ups of all time. Even now, public awareness remains low for the number of lives claimed by greed and racism, but based on Killers of the Flower Moon's cast and story, the film promises to shed light on the crime ring responsible for so much loss of life. Scorsese and his cast provide visibility to a dark time in history with the promise of enlightening viewers about the injustices the victims and their families have endured. Killers of the Flower Moon is based on a book about the Osage murders. Killers of the Flower Moon is based on the 2017 nonfiction novel Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Killers of the Flower Moon's book focuses on members of the Osage Indian Nation in Oklahoma who, in the 1920s, were some of the richest people, per capita, in the world thanks to oil found beneath their land. From living in mansions and being driven in chauffeured cars to sending their children to the best schools in Europe, they lived a life of luxury on land once deemed worthless. Convinced that the Osage didn't know how to properly handle their newfound wealth, a guardian program was established consisting entirely of white Oklahomans, and even the smallest purchases, like toothpaste, were monitored and required approval. The FBI was in its infancy, but since anyone who investigated the murders was killed themselves, a young J. Edgar Hoover took up the case, and it became the organization's first major murder investigation. Hoover created an undercover team including Texas Ranger Tom White and one of the few first American agents in the Bureau to track down the killers and bring them to justice. When Killers of the Flower Moon takes place. Killers of the Flower Moon mystery. How much time is covered before Killers of the Flower Moon's ending is a bit vague in the movie, but the murders that devastated the Osage Nation lasted for years. The movie does not explicitly state what year it takes place in, but Ernest Burkhart's time in Oklahoma begins around 1920. He quickly reconnects with his uncle William King Hale and meets his future wife Molly Kyle. The timeline of events that unfold from here happens across 5 or 6 years, depending on when exactly Ernest arrives in Oklahoma, leading up to the trial that takes place in 1926. William King Hale was a leader of the Osage murders. Leonardo DiCaprio as Ernest Burkhart and Lily Gladstone as Molly Burkhart sitting at a table in Killers of the Flower Moon. The Osage murders, also known as the Reign of Terror, were documented between 1921 and 1926 and included dozens of Osage victims, some of them from the same family, but it's thought that the killings actually began as early as the 1910s. One Osage woman, Molly Burkhart, watched her entire family be killed in front of her, including her older sister Anna Brown shot, her cousin Charles Whitehorn, and her mother Lizzie Q. Kyle slowly poisoned. One by one, more Osage were murdered under mysterious circumstances, growing from 24 victims when Hoover and the FBI got involved to over 60. As Grant's novel reveals, the murders were not simply the rogue deeds of one or two people in a tiny Oklahoma town, but part of a conspiracy by white townspeople, lawmen, and lawmakers that extended to Washington, D.C. Fear and greed got the better of cattle barons like Hale who looked at the suddenly wealthy Osage with contempt and saw an opportunity, murdering them for their oil-rich land and the headrights that granted them annual royalties. Even members of Hoover's investigation team were aware of the nature of the murders and turned a blind eye due to avarice and racism. The FBI's investigation of the Reign of Terror explained. Killers of the Flower Moon. Jesse Plemons as Tom White. The FBI's predecessor, the Bureau of Investigation, held a major investigation of the Reign of Terror, some of which was explored in Killers of the Flower Moon via Jesse Plemons. Thomas Bruce White Sr. After several of the murders took place, the Osage tribal elders enlisted the help of the BOI in 1925. White traveled to Oklahoma alongside several other agents, with them mostly working undercover due to corruption in the police force. Molly Burkhart's priest informed the BOI that Ernest was attempting to kill her, causing the BOI to investigate him. Upon realizing the extent of the Osage murders, the BOI expanded its investigation. By the time that the BOI investigation was completed, several of the accomplices had died, although the investigation did aid in sending several others to prison. How many people were charged for the Osage murders? Robert De Niro as William Hale and Brendan Fraser as W. South Hamilton sit in court in Killers of the Flower Moon. Unfortunately, most of the Osage murders were never prosecuted, but a few perpetrators were convicted, including Hale, who ordered Anna Brown to be murdered by Kelsey Morrison to gain control of her oil rights. Hale led a crime ring known as King of the Osage Hills with his nephews Byron and Ernest, all of whom conspired to gain the head rights of prominent tribal members. The Department of the Interior charged a few dozen members of the Osage Guardian program with corruption after they had already swindled their charges out of millions, but each of them settled out of court.